A couple of years ago I made a video on the reserve shooter and how I feel like it didn't really need a nerf after Air Blast was changed. I also stated that the reserve shooter is still a pretty decent secondary choice on Pyro, and I still believe that both of these statements are true, and probably more so for the latter point. But why is this the case still? Didn't the reserve shooter suffer a terrible fate in Jungle Inferno that made it literally unusable according to some players? Well no, because you see, the reserve shooter in my opinion fits in that small gap between stock and the panic attack in that it provides the best of both worlds. Well, I can't combo it from the Air Blast anymore, so it doesn't matter. Shh, get over it. Valve did the right thing back in the Jungle Inferno update by removing the ability to mini-crit airborne targets from an Air Blast, as before then, that was an unbelievably broken weapon when compared with a Degreaser. Once the update rolled around, Pyro had their Air Blast mechanics changed and the broken stat was removed, balancing it out for use on both Soldier and Pyro alike. Nowadays, the reserve shooter rewards mini-crit on enemies that are launched airborne from explosions, grapple hooks, or the thermal thruster, as well as deploying 20% faster at the cost of 2 less shots per clip. While you may not get too much use out of the grapple hook section if you don't play manpower or certain community servers, I believe the rest of the stats are a perfect middle ground of the other two shotguns for the Pyro. The current stats are honestly not that bad and absolutely make it great for both Soldier and Pyro respectively. Sure, Soldier has the better use from it now, but you'd be surprised at how well it works with the Pyro still. The combo Pyro playstyle will get the most out of this, which I'll delve into a little more in a short while. For now, I want to compare it to the other two shotgun choices for the fire-wielding Arsonist. As I've stated, the reserve shooter is kind of the in-between shotgun of both the stock shotgun and panic attack, whilst providing its own unique ability that can make the Pyro even more of a counter to certain classes they're already won to. The biggest difference between the other two choices and the reserve shooter is the lack of 2 extra shots in each clip. This can be somewhat difficult to handle when you're used to 6, since it leaves a bigger margin of error if you're in a fight. Missing 2 shots with the shotgun and panic attack isn't nearly as bad as missing them with the reserve shooter with the bigger clip in those two. However, overall as a hit scan secondary weapon, it could have a hell of a lot of worse stats overall, and you can get over this change fairly quickly. Now, with how the reserve shooter functions is exactly the same as stock. Unlike the panic attack bullet accuracy getting worse with each shot, the reserve shooter doesn't have any difference in the way it works from the base shotgun. 10 pellets per shot, each doing 9 damage for an overall maximum damage total of 90. Sure, this is less than the panic attack's 108 damage, which I've gone on record saying is the absolute best choice for Pyro in terms of shotguns numerous times in the past, but this puts it on an equal level to the stock straight away. What I feel puts it on a totally different level from both, however, is the switch speed bonus. Again, I know that the panic attack also has a switch speed bonus. In fact, it's 30% faster than the reserve shooters at 50%. However, you remember that part I said about being the same as stock? Well, that 20% faster deployment along with that little nugget of info means that the reserve shooter has the capabilities of both stock and the panic attack rolled into one. Of course, this is kind of a jack of all trades scenario, but I feel like it could be a decent choice if the panic attack doesn't suit you, but you want a little more from stock still. If you enjoy stock a lot and can deal with 2 less shots fairly well, I think the reserve shooter can be an excellent alternative to use. Just like the panic attack, the faster deployment speed is great in a combo Pyro playstyle, since it will allow you to switch faster to your secondary to deal with enemies outside of your flamethrower's reach. A scout, for example, could take about 60 damage from your primary and be making an escape. With the reserve shooter, not only are you going to be switching faster, but you'll also be dealing more damage because of that speed. Being closer with a shotgun obviously means that you'll do better damage, so the speed really benefits the Pyro in that regard. But let's say that you like the panic attack more. The panic attack has a fixed shot pattern and will do more damage up close. The problem is that outside of close range, the panic attack's damage potential falls off significantly. This is where the reserve shooter's similarities to stock play off better. From a distance, the panic attack will do very little above 3 chip damage. The stock and reserve shooter will do more, but of course, like I mentioned, the faster deployment speed could mean the difference of doing more or less damage. This isn't to say that the reserve shooter is better than stock though, far from it. I've already mentioned that the panic attack does better up close, which benefits the Pyro's playstyle overall, and stock is stock, consistent and reliable. Whilst I did say that missing 2 shots in each clip could theoretically not matter too much in the long run, 6 shots are still better than 4. It's not just about missing the shots, as dealing with a fully overhealed heavy with just a reserve shooter will likely result in failure compared to the other choices, as even at full damage, 360 damage won't take the heavy down without reloading compared to the stock's 540 and the panic attack's 648 damage respectively. It's a very specific example, but it at least shows that a Pyro will be missing out on dealing quite a lot of damage compared to the other two choices, even with that faster deployment. If you're fighting another class with stock, you should have the advantage like with another Pyro. But of course it all depends on the situation, and the extra shots could end up being the difference between who wins and who loses. It's difficult to say that it's straight up better than the other two when you consider all of this alongside Pyro's other shotguns, let alone the range of flare guns at their disposal too. But we haven't even started to talk about the main feature that made this broken back in the day for Pyros, and really the stat that makes the reserve shooter what it is. Mini crit damage on target to launched airborne by explosions, grapple hooks or rocket packs, aka the thermal thruster. As previously stated, the rocket pack section of the stat was originally for air blasts, and considering how easy it would be to switch from weapons like the degreaser to the reserve shooter before Jungle Inferno, and the fact that air blast always pushed enemies the same way every time, this made the weapon broken on the Pyro. I've always argued that just because one thing was changed, that the other didn't need changing alongside it. What I mean by that is that in Jungle Inferno, either air blasting in general should have been the only thing changed, or the stat that gave mini crits to air blasted enemies removed, not both. If the air blast worked like before, then the stat obviously needed removing 100%. However, we got an entire revamp on the mechanic, which I argue meant that the stat didn't need removing on the reserve shooter at all. However, knowing more about how the new air blast works nowadays, perhaps the Pyro would have found a way to abuse it like back in the day, so maybe changing both was a smart choice in the long run. Anyway, to the actual stat itself now, mini crits on enemies soaring through the air is a fairly specific stat to have for a weapon, let alone a shotgun for a class specifically made for close range combat. While ignoring the fact that the reserve shooter wasn't even intended for Pyro in the first place, I believe that the reserve shooter is still incredibly powerful against enemies who like to jump around, those classes being soldiers and demo man for the most part, and pyros and engineers on the rare occasion. I don't think it needs to be stated that soldier and demo man are the two classes you think of when it comes to soaring through the skies in combat. The soldier has the rocket jump and the demo man has sticky jumping, along with being able to jump with grenade pills. But Pyro doesn't shoot rockets or sticky bombs, so how do they manage to get the mini crit? Well, that's easy, you air blast. While sticky bombs are fairly hard to move once they've been placed, grenade pills and rockets are easy enough to reflect back at enemies. Air blasting these projectiles back at enemies in the right area will launch them in the air, which is the perfect time for the reserve shooter to do what it does best. And honestly, you could essentially do this to any class as long as you aim properly. Soldier and demo man will obviously be the classes you air blast these back at most of the time, but you could potentially reflect a rocket at a medic's feet and finish them off with the reserve shooter. Really, the reserve shooter isn't restricted to just the jump classes if you know what you're doing. This can be applied to enemies who are jumping into battle, trying to escape, or even against those pesky market gardener soldiers. Really, the air blast is there to help initiate the crit against a particular trigger happy soldier or demo trying to attack your team. Punish them with a couple of shots and that gets rid of those pesky projectile classes for a short while. It should also be mentioned that friendly soldiers and demo men are able to assist you with launching enemies in the air, further proving that the reserve shooter isn't specifically made for attacking one or two classes. If you see a soldier launch someone mid-air or a demo man sticky pop someone up, your best choice as a pyro is to whip your reserve shooter out and help deal additional damage. This helps make sure that launching enemies in the air isn't solely the pyro's duty and that working with your team will make it even more effective. Now on to the lesser known classes this is useful against. First, the easier one to explain is the Engineer. Since the Wrangler was released in the 2010 Engineer update, the Engineer has been able to perform sentry jumps with level 3 sentries. This does count as being launched airborne by explosions, letting the Pyro take down any Engineer dumb enough to sentry jump in front of them. It's a pretty rare occurrence, but it's just yet another counter the Pyro has in their pocket. Last but not least is against other Pyros. Another seemingly obvious choice is against thermal thruster Pyros, as rare as those can be at times. Whilst this is a clear reason behind using it against Pyros, this isn't the only use on flying Pyros. Remember the detonator and scorch shot? Well, they technically count as explosions, meaning if you see a flare jump in Pyro, you can use this to your advantage. I went in and tested this myself to see if it were true, and it was. This honestly surprised me considering it's not mentioned at all on the wiki or anywhere else I searched. And I'm not surprised after testing this out. When I came to record clips to show it working with people on the server, no matter what we did, we couldn't get the mini crits to work on Pyros and Engineers. Over and over we tried all sorts of different ways to make it work and it just didn't. This really frustrated me considering me and Hexalina had tested this a couple of days before and it worked. So this stumped both of us since she was also there when we were recording. So after that session, I just sat there contemplating why it didn't want to work. I just couldn't figure it out. So I messaged a friend to see if he could help me work it all out. We joined one server, tested all of them again, and nothing. We then joined a different server, and oh, would you look at that, it worked. And you want to know why this all happened? Ping. I'm not even joking, the fucking ping is what nerfed a part of this weapon's effectiveness. Let me break it down for you. When I played with the group on my server earlier in the day, it was a mixture of EU and US people. We first went on an EU server and we tested it on both kinds of people and no dice. We also tried it on a US server and again, nothing. Even with Hexalina it didn't work, even though we were both from the same country. It was only later when I tried it with another friend that we were able to figure it out. The first server we tried it on was a US server. When that didn't work, we tried a British server, which was where it worked. So do you see the pattern? Not only does the Pyro and Engineer section not work in a server in a region you're not from, even if the player isn't from your region yet is on a server that is in your region, it still doesn't work. The player has to be both from the area you're from, but also in a server from that same region. And even then that's not guaranteed to work, since it didn't work on EU players in an EU server earlier on in the day. Now, while I did mention that this only affects two classes that won't be jumping as much as Soldier and Demoman players, this is still really busted and not in the good way. I have no idea how messed up the sauce spaghetti is to have a whole weapons mechanic be messed up based on ping, but they did it. This has to be some sort of new discovery surely, since I've never heard of it before. It's not weapon breaking per se, but this drove me insane throughout the day I tested this and thought that this was something that needed to be shared. But overall, this shows that a reserve shooter isn't a terrible weapon at all, particularly on the Pyro, which the community has dubbed pointless to use on them. By no means is a reserve shooter a no-go after Jungle Inferno and can be used in literally every situation the other two shotgun choices are used for. Now, just like the Panic Attack, this shines in a combo Pyro loadout just before the nerf, but of course not as well as that. The Degreaser is basically the perfect primary to use alongside the reserve shooter, with the faster holstering speed of the Degreaser combined with the reserve shooter's 20% deployment adding up to a pretty good 50% faster switch to. Of course, this is trumped by the Panic Attack's 80% when paired with the Degreaser, but this is still a commendable number when you want a shotgun that functions like stock, but with a slightly faster switch speed than that. There isn't really any melee that benefits more than the other when alongside this, so your typical choice of either the Power Jack, Extinguisher or Back Scratcher aren't bad depending on what playstyle you prefer. It doesn't need to be stated, but I might as well mention that this shouldn't be your first choice of damage unless you're at a distance. It's called a secondary weapon for a reason, but what a decent shotgun it is. I know the other two choices are better, there's no question about that, but the main point I wanted to get across is that the reserve shooter is still good. Not only does it help with countering two of the most powerful classes in the game, it deals with the two lesser used jump classes alongside it, offering a mixture of both stock and a Panic Attack with its own uniqueness. Is it the best? No, but you could be using far worse as Pyro. The stats that the reserve shooter decides to nab from the other shotguns are all good and provides more power when fighting more versatile classes at the same time. It's just people calling it useless after the nerf are kinda missing the point of the nerf. It was broken as hell before Jungle Inferno, but now it's relatively good. Having a clear-cut choice for a weapon slot is never a good thing, since no one will bother using other weapons when the best thing does everything but just better. I honestly recommend you give it a go again if you're one of the people who don't see anything in it. The reserve shooter is by no means the secret greatest weapon in the game, but it's still a really fun weapon to use on the Pyro and can be a lot more useful than you may first think. Variety is the spice of life, and the reserve shooter is just another spice for you to try. It may not be the best, but gosh darn is it far from terrible. Well, this has been your Pyro enthusiast BonOakley signing out. See you guys in the next one.